Hey everybody, Cactus Smasher here, and it's New Year's Eve. 2014's over and 2015 is coming upon us. 2014 was a really excellent year for me in terms of reading. I love reading. I didn't used to do it as much as I wanted to, but lately this year I just kept reading and I never stopped. And I read almost 50 books this year, about 48, 49. So I just thought it would be fun to make a little video talking about my top 10 books that I've read this year. These aren't going to be books that were necessarily published this year, just books that I read. I only have one of the books on this list in a physical copy because most of these books that I read over the year were read from the library, so I don't have them with me, unfortunately, to show you, but I will be putting cover art up here. Sorry if you hear chewing. My pet rats are chewing on the bars of their cage. Number 10 is The Marberry Lens by Andrew Smith. I did a little bit of experimentation this year in terms of reading. I don't normally read YA. It's not my genre. I don't really find it that interesting. But I felt that I needed to read some of it this year just to see what the lay of the land was like, to get an idea of what, was popular among that audience. And for the most part, the few YA novels that I read about 4 or 5, were not that great. Self-insert fan fiction, basically. But The Marberry Lens is something different. I'm not even sure why this book was marketed as YA, because it's filled with adult themes and cursing and violence and just really, really dark stuff. It's about this boy who's kidnapped and nearly raped by this sort of child rapist guy, and he escapes, and him and his friend go off to London to spend the summer there. While there, he meets this guy who gives him these glasses that allow him to see another world sort of beneath ours, kind of a parallel universe. But it's a completely different world that's torn apart by violence and this terrible plague. And this book just really floored me. I mean, it wasn't at all what I expected. I mean, it's suspenseful. It's within kind of a fantasy framework, but a lot of the stuff that happens in the book is completely horrific. It's fierce, it's intelligent, it explores the nature of trauma, sexual trauma, PTSD, that kind of thing. One of the things that I really liked about it was that for a while you're not really sure if what's happening is real, where the protagonist is at mentally speaking. You don't know if this is really happening to him, if he's imagining things, and it's a big sprawling work. My only real problem with it was the fact that it just kind of ends. There's no real kind of conclusion. That's because there's a sequel, and I actually have the sequel here. This is Passenger by Andrew Smith. Don't know if you can see that, but this is the sequel, Passenger, which I haven't read yet, but I'm really eager to get to it because The Marberry Lens was just a fantastic work. Number 9 is Dweller by Geoff Strand. I wanted to kind of read a lot more horror this year because horror is my genre. That's my preferred genre to read. And I borrowed this book from a friend, not really knowing what to expect, except that he recommended it to me. I'm a big fan of monsters. I love monsters in any shape or form that I can get them. And that's what this book is about. This book is about a boy who, while wandering in the woods one day as a young kid, he meets this monster. But gradually what happens is that he forms a friendship with this monster, and the book follows the relationship between this boy and this monster throughout their entire lives. Now, the cover for this book is very misleading. It's a really crappy Photoshop that makes it look like some sordid horror paperback about a kid who uses a monster to get revenge on his bullies. It's nothing like that. It is this incredibly moving, emotional, sprawling work, and explores essentially the relationship between a boy and his monster. And it explores how that relationship is beneficial, and yet how it's also dangerous and unhealthy. He's almost chained to this monster, but he's chained to it because he wants to, because the monster means something to him, because the monster, at the end of the day, is the only living thing that really meant anything to him. It's an incredible work. It's very well written. You could read the monster as a metaphor for addiction or any kind of hang-up that we might have trouble letting go of, and how sometimes we need to let go of those things or they will end in tragedy or disaster. But at the same time, you feel bad for the monster. You relate to the monster and the boy because, in a twisted sort of way, they both have had such similar lives. They kind of rely on each other, and you feel sorry for the both of them. And it's an incredible work. Read it if you can find it. Number 8 is Suicide by Edouard Leve. Edouard Leve was a French author and artist who worked primarily in photography who unfortunately committed suicide in 2007. And this book, Suicide, was the last thing that he ever wrote, and essentially it serves as his suicide note. It's a very slim volume that is basically one really long kind of internal letter or reflection from a friend of a friend who committed suicide. And throughout the entire book, the man reflects on what he knew about the friend who committed suicide, and about his relationship to the friend and his relationship to other people, and how this friend's suicide has affected him and everyone around him. It's a short work, but it's incredible the way that it explores the effect of suicide on not just the person committing the deed, but everyone around them, the emotional impact, the way that things change, the way that dynamics shift, the way that people rethink their relationships after someone has killed themselves. It's written like a memory. It's very stream of consciousness, and through this you get a very scattershot but complete portrait of who this man is and what this friend meant to him, and it's full of wonderful prose and weird little asides, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful work, and it's made especially more poignant because of the author's fate, knowing that he killed himself and that this novel essentially served as his suicide note. And number 7 is Consumed by David Cronenberg. I'm a huge, huge, huge fan of David Cronenberg. I love his films. I think he's one of the most consistently interesting and intelligent filmmakers out there. And when I found out that David Cronenberg was publishing a novel, I flipped my lid. I was so excited. I immediately went out and found a copy at the library, and I devoured it in like 3 days. Consumed is typical of his film work. It features sexual corruption, sexually transmitted diseases, themes of infection, the melding of flesh with technology, of technology's impact on humanity. I can't explain the whole thing to you in a video like this. I'll just say that it follows 2 photojournalists and explores their investigation of this murder. This cannibal murder of this famous French philosopher's couple. You go through this Cronenbergian underground of perverts and twisted psyches and weird intellectuals, and it's wonderful. It's very strange. It's very twisted. It's written in a very dry, economical style. But it's incredibly engrossing, and I loved it. I read the whole thing cover to cover. I'm so glad that Cronenberg is moving into different forms of media, and I hope he's getting old now. He's like in his early 70s. I hope he's got a few more books in him, because if that's the sort of quality that he's putting out, I mean, that's fantastic, and I can't wait to see more from him. Number 6 is The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. I'm a huge fan of the movie. I saw it for the first time about a year ago when a friend showed it to me, and at first I didn't really know what to think of it because I'd heard of it and I saw the cover and I was like, The Last Unicorn, that's for girls, but he showed it to me and it was an incredible movie. It was nothing like I expected, and so I wanted to read the book to see how it compared. And surprisingly, the book was fantastic. I mean, even better than the movie. The book just makes things feel so much more momentous, and with the florid language and the fantastic prose style, it really kind of solidifies this sense of being sort of a modern-day fairy tale. But in a strange sort of way, it's also commenting, I think, on the nature of myth itself, on the archetypes of myth, because all of Amalthea's kind of coterie, you know, Schmendrick the Magician and Molly Grew, they kind of willingly exist on the fringes, and we learn more about them than we do about any of the other characters in the books, and yet they don't really necessarily get the same kind of character growth, the same kind of archetypal fantasy hero's journey that Amalthea and Prince Lear do, and yet in a weird sort of way they kind of accept that. They accept that this is our role, that this is their role as characters in this mythological story. It's almost like we're seeing past we're seeing through the veneer of the typical fantasy archetypal story, and it's really fascinating. And the language is gorgeous. It's poetic and mythic and epic and gigantic, and it's one of the best fantasy novels I think I've ever read, and I recommend it along with the movie. They exist side by side, which is pretty amazing, because you would think that, you know, one would kind of supersede the other, but they're both fantastic. Any way that you take in the story of The Last Unicorn, take it in. It's a fantastic, fantastic story. Number 5 is A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole. This is another book where the author committed suicide after trying to get this book published, and it wasn't published until his mother campaigned for it years and years and years after, until it was finally published in 1982, I believe, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. This is a incredibly staggering work of comic genius. It's a picaresque novel about the world's most corpulent, disgusting man named Ignatius J. Reilly, who has these antiquated ideas about morality and justice and all this stuff, and the novel basically follows him and the people around him as he attempts to find a job, or he'll get kicked out of his mother's house. And it's an incredibly, incredibly funny book. It's a very dark comedy. I mean, the comedy is satire of the bleakest order, but it is so funny. These comic situations kind of pile onto each other, and what's really amazing about the book is that these aren't just, you know, little vignettes that, you know, serve to highlight the world that he lives in. They're all intertwined, and the characters that he meet other characters that he met earlier in the book. It's such an amazing book. You've got to read it. I can't do it justice in this video. Number 4 is American Psycho by Bret, Easton, Ellis. This is a similar story to The Last Unicorn, where I was really familiar with the movie. I love the movie. It's one of my favorite movies of the 2000s. But I wanted to read the book because I've heard all this stuff about Bret Easton Ellis and how the book is just, you know, horrible and disgusting, and I wanted to see for myself. Holy shit, they were right. This is one of the most depraved, disgusting books I've ever read. The torture that Patrick Bateman puts these women under is so abhorrent and so over the top that in some ways it's almost comical, but Bret Easton Ellis describes the events with such a detached air and such a clarity of detail that you can't help but feel repulsed. But that's the whole point of the book. I feel like Bret Easton Ellis is commenting on, you know, the nature of capitalism, especially in America, how greed turns us into basically unfeeling monsters. And Patrick Bateman, he is so detached from the world around him and from reality that he's a literal monster. He literally treats people like meat. It's also like a Confederacy of Dunces. It's also incredibly funny in a really bleak, dark way. This came through somewhat in the movie, but it really comes through in the book. You know, the dry humor, the nonplussed, you know, violent responses from Patrick Bateman to the banal things that his friends have said to him. Patrick Bateman describes every detail. When Patrick Bateman meets somebody, for example, he describes them down to every detail, down to the brand names of the clothing they're wearing. And again, I love that, because that shows what a materialist he is, because he focuses only on the brands, on what people are wearing, on what they own, on who they are based on what they've bought. You have to read it. It's not for the faint of heart, definitely, but if you can stomach that sort of thing, it's a fantastic book. Number 3 is The Lost by Jack Ketchum. I've been on kind of a Jack Ketchum kick recently because one of my friends, the same friend who lent me Dweller, really recommended him. And I've read about 5 of his novels from the library, and I liked all of them, but this one, The Lost, is my favorite. It's an incredibly harrowing psychological portrait of a man, a young murderer, going insane, of losing his mind. It's the story of a man who thinks that he's in control, that he has the world wrapped around his finger, and slowly the world comes crashing down around him. And we, as the readers, know that when that happens, something terrible will happen, and it does. It takes place in the 60s, and as it explores this sort of teenage serial killer, this teenage murderer, it seems to be commenting on the end of the close of the 60s, the loss of innocence that came with Vietnam and the Sharon Tate murders, and it's sort of personifying all of these things in the story of this small town that is slowly kind of losing its mind. Ketchum has such an economy of words. Every sentence seems like deliberate and constructed and beautiful, and this book is so unbelievably tense because we know what's coming. Pressure slowly builds and builds and builds until it explodes in this horrible, rageful, violent spree that's just incredibly written. Ketchum has such a way with writing characters that you really begin to care about and then doing horrible things to them, and the rug gets pulled out from you so many times in his work, and that's what I love about him. He has an incredibly dark, nihilistic sensibility that's incredibly engrossing and intoxicating, and he's an amazing author. He's so much more than just a horror author. I mean, and especially I would say with this book, with The Lost, I mean, this is a work of art. It's a work of literature, and you've got to read it. Number 2 is Was by Geoff Ryman. Was explores the mythology of the Wizard of Oz, the shared cultural mythology of Oz. Through several interlinking storylines. One story follows the real Dorothy Gale, a young girl who moves to Kansas after her mother dies of diphtheria, and it explores how her life is just full of pain and torment, and how she escapes through fantasy. And there's several other stories involving a gay actor who is dying of HIV, who's seeing a psychiatrist who also had a run-in with Dorothy Gale years later when she was committed to an insane asylum. It explores the making of the film of The Wizard of Oz, and it explores Judy Garland's life, and all of these things tie together through the shared mythology of Oz, through what the novel personifies as the land of was, of the past, of escaping to this idealized place of being, the place of was, and it does this with incredible lyricism, and it mixes all these stories together with an incredibly deft hand, and it is so incredibly moving and so incredibly elegiac and evocative, and it made me cry. I loved it that much. I never really understood the connection of The Wizard of Oz with a shared kind of gay identity until I read this book. Through the metaphor of Oz, it explores the shelter that LGBT people wish they could have. It's a fascinating work of literature. It's wonderful. And now for the number 1 book on my list. This is the one that I actually own a physical copy of, and this is hands down the best book that I've read in 2014. Probably the best book I've read in 5 years. And that book is Exquisite Corpse by Poppy Z. Brite. I'd read a few things about Poppy Brite. I knew about him, about his work. I knew that he explored LGBT themes frequently, but I'd never read any of his work. And I borrowed a paperback copy of this from the same friend who lent me Dweller and told me about Jack Ketchum, and I didn't really know what to expect. All I knew was that this book was inspired by Jeffrey Dahmer, and I'm fascinated with Jeffrey Dahmer. I think he's one of the most interesting serial killers that I've ever read about. So I thought this would just be like a serial killer thing, but it's not. It's so much more than that. It is... How do I explain it? This book follows Andrew Compton and Jay Byrne, 2 serial killers from very different parts of the world who meet and end up in this kind of twisted love story. They end up falling in love over their mutual love of death and of corpses and murder. It also follows this young Vietnamese-American boy named Tran, who they both kind of have their eyes on. And it also follows the story of his ex-boyfriend Luke, who goes on these rants over his own personal pirate radio station about heteronormative society. All these storylines converge in this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful work of just pain and torment and heartbreak and beauty. What was so incredible about this work was that Brite mixes horrible violence with incredibly erotic sex, and it creates this intoxicating mix of sex and horror, death and love. Every character is damaged in some way. Every character is trapped, or they're sometimes literally infected in one way or another. The theme of HIV, of the AIDS virus, runs prominently through this book, and Brite explores infection as kind of an expression of love, of desire, of ultimate bonding. And through this book, he seems to be making a statement about the whole of the gay community, of our shared kind of cultural and physical, emotional isolation from each other, and how sometimes the only way that we can express love and express feeling is through really horrible acts of violence, of infection, of death, of pain. It's an incredible, incredible, incredible work of art. It is a beautiful novel, and one of the most amazing things about it is that it takes several horrible people, especially the murderers, of course, but every character in this book, as I said, is incredibly flawed, incredibly just reprehensible human beings, and it makes you understand them. And in some cases, it even makes you see things the way they do. You can almost understand when Andrew and Jay talk about the beauty of death or the love that comes from mutilating a corpse, the aesthetic appreciation of death. And that is so incredible that he makes these reprehensible characters, if not likable, understandable, and even almost sympathetic. And it's an incredibly moving book. It's full of horrid violence, but the violence is so beautifully written. I couldn't get it out of my head for days. I laid in bed just thinking about this book and the ending and just everything that happened in it. I couldn't get it out of my head. This is such an incredible book, and I don't know how to put it into words just how great it is. It wasn't only really well written, it didn't only stick with me, I mean, it penetrated me, it violated me, it opened up my chest and my soul, it looked directly into my heart, and it just captured me. I just love this book, and this is one of the best books I've ever read in my whole life. You have to read this. If you read one book out of any of the books on this list, read Exquisite Corpse by Poppy Z. Brite. It is just a fantastic work of literature. Alright, those are my top 10 books of 2014, or that I read in 2014. If you liked this video, subscribe if you want. If you have any suggestions for other books that you think I would like, leave them in the comments. If you have your own top 10, leave that in the comments. And I'll see you guys later. I'll see you next year, hopefully. And hopefully next year I'll read a lot more. Alright, bye.